Hello again, my name is Dr. Jacob Gran, and in this video, we will finally arrive at how to add a third voice to our counterpoint exercises. In this video, we will introduce the notion of chords and harmonies, and a lot of music theory is built around trying to find patterns in chord progressions. Unfortunately, knowing those theories of harmony won't help us to compose our counterpoint exercises. Instead, we're going to try to view these vertical slices simply as coincidences, happy accidents that arise from the voice leading and the goal-directed motion of three melodies moving together horizontally. Composing three simultaneous melodies that are all equally fluent requires us to make some compromises, but it also gives us new freedoms that weren't available in two-voice writing. Remembering our one-to-one exercises from two-voice counterpoint, we know that there are only 4 consonant harmonic intervals. Thirds, fifths, sixths, and octaves are our only choices for forming a consonance above any given bass note. Let's take the bass note C as an example. If we want to add 2 new notes, both of which are consonant above the bass, then there are only 6 possible combinations of these 4 intervals. We can have a fifth and a third, a sixth and a third, an octave and a third, a sixth and a fifth, an octave and a fifth, or an octave and a sixth. When there are more than 2 notes sounding at the same time, we call the group of notes a chord. Notice that these chords are the possibilities for adding 2 different notes above a bass. If we wanted to add 2 of the same note, like this, the list would be much larger. But this type of chord is usually avoided in strict 3-voice counterpoint. For whatever reason, the interval of an octave between the upper parts was considered to be a weak voicing, so we'll do our best to avoid this type of chord. As a rule of thumb, octave doublings should only ever double whatever tone is in our bass voice. To classify our chord types, we use something called figured bass, which is a measure of the simplified intervals above the bass tone. By simplified, I mean that we don't distinguish between registers, so this first 5/3 chord in our list could also have been voiced in open position like this, and we would still call it a 5/3 chord, even though the third is technically a tenth. For our purposes, a tenth is the same as a third, a 12th is a fifth, etc. We simplify things so that our figured bass symbols reflect what the chord sounds like. All 5/3 chords are going to sound similar in chord quality, even if they have different voicings. The figured bass symbols show the intervals that the upper voices form against the bass, but there is another harmonic interval that is just as important that is not shown in the figures. That is the interval formed between the upper parts. We notice that the interval formed between the upper parts of the 6/3 chord and the 8/5 chord is a perfect fourth. Uh-oh. The interval of a fourth is not on our list of harmonic consonances. Fourths were dissonant in two-voice writing. But that's okay, because of the first rule in composing counterpoint in 3 voices. Fourths formed between upper parts are treated as imperfect consonances. Fourths are only considered dissonant if they are formed between one of the upper voices and the bass. In other words, if the fourth would show up in our figured bass symbol. And notice that these fourths are treated as imperfect consonances. That means you may approach them by direct motion, and even have parallel fourths, as long as they are formed between the upper parts. The interval formed between the notes A and G in our 6/5 chord is a diatonic second, which is a dissonance. 6/5 chords therefore cannot be used in our note-against-note exercises, because the chord contains a dissonant interval. 6/5 chords are a very important type of dissonant chord, and we will return to them in future videos. The 5/3 and 6/3 chords are special, because they are the only chord types that have 3 different notes that all form consonant relationships with one another. We call these chord types triads. Since our goal is to have 3 independent melodies, triads are extremely useful in guaranteeing that each melody forms correct one-to-one consonances with the others, while also providing for the maximum richness of sound, since you get a harmonic blending of 3 different scale degrees. Compare that to the 8-3, 8-5, and 8-6 chords, where one of the upper voices is an octave doubling of the bass tone. Now let's talk about how to form a melodic cadence in 3 voices. Almost every Cantus Firmus that we've encountered so far has ended with a stepwise descent from scale degree 2 to scale degree 1. Historically, this became known as the tenor cadence. The contrary stepwise cadence, from scale degree 7 to scale degree 1, is known as the soprano cadence. And these 2 cadences are the best type of melodic closure, and we use them over and over again in our 2-voice exercises. The combination of these cadences was known as the clausula vera, or true closure, since this was the strongest way to end a phrase or an entire composition in the 16th and 17th centuries. I should mention that just because we call these the soprano and tenor cadences does not mean that they must only occur in the soprano and tenor voices. Sopranos can perform a tenor cadence, and tenors can perform a soprano cadence. Calling them the soprano and tenor cadences is a little more memorable than calling them just the 7-1 and 2-1 cadences, since they most often and most idiomatically occur in the voices after which they are named. As I mentioned a moment ago, these are the historical names, from back when cadences were conceived in terms of melodic formulas. Very few of today's musicians would use these terms in conversation. So, how do we add a 3rd voice to this already perfect clausula vera? If we try to add a bass voice, we know that it must end on scale degree 1, just like the other 2 voices. But unlike the other 2 voices, the bass cannot approach scale degree 1 by stepwise motion, since if we approach by scale degree 7 or 2, we would be composing parallel octaves with either the soprano or tenor. We're going to have to leap to scale degree 1 from another note, and that note must form a consonant chord with scale degrees 7 and 2. There is only one note that fits that description, and it is scale degree 5. In this example, the notes G, D, and B in the second to last measure form a 5-3 position chord, and this is the most standard 3-voice cadence. The leap from scale degree 5 to scale degree 1 in the bass voice is called the bass cadence. Notice, though, that although this is the only way to allow all 3 voices to come to a strong melodic closure, it is not an ideal solution. That is because the bass and tenor voices approach the final octave by direct motion, which is forbidden in 2-voice writing. You might think that we can solve that by switching the direction of the leap in the bass, going up a 4th instead of down a 5th. That almost works, but now there's direct motion to the octave between the bass and soprano cadences. This leads us to the biggest concession we need to make in 3-voice counterpoint. Direct motion to a perfect consonance is sometimes unavoidable. Luckily, we are only completely forced to do this at cadences, and the direct motion is similar rather than parallel. This is one of the reasons textbooks make such a big deal about avoiding parallel fifths and parallel octaves. Similar fifths and octaves are unavoidable once we venture beyond 2 voices. But just because it's unavoidable doesn't mean we shouldn't try to avoid it in the spirit of voice-leading independence. My advice is to accept this voice-leading error at a cadence, and if you must accept it anywhere in the middle of an exercise, make sure that the 3rd voice is moving in contrary motion to the other 2 for a counterbalancing effect. The other cadence to consider is what happens if we try to add a third voice in between our soprano and tenor cadences. This happens whenever we place the cantus firmus in the lowest voice of the texture. We need to find a note located above scale degree 2 and below scale degree 7 that is consonant with both of those notes. Just like before, there is only one solution, scale degree 4. The note F in this example forms a third above D and an augmented fourth below B. You might say, hold on, augmented fourths are dissonant, and you would be right. But remember that fourths between upper parts are treated as imperfect consonances, and that goes for all diatonic fourths, not just the perfect ones. The middle voice of this 6/3 chord is not going to cadence on scale degree 1. Instead, it will move by step either down to scale degree 3 or up to scale degree 5, also sometimes known as a Burgundian cadence, depending on whether you want the exercise to conclude on an 8/3 chord or an 8/5 chord. The student character, Joseph, from Gradus ad Parnassum, preferred the 4/3 alto cadence, while the teacher character, Alois, preferred the 4/5 version. Fuchs allowed his characters to agree to disagree. Another area of disagreement between the two characters had to do with the correct style of three-voice exercises. Alois presents this example of a well-formed three-voice exercise. One thing to notice before we take a listen is that we can tolerate longer stretches of parallel motion between two voices, as long as the other voice, in this case the bass, moves in contrary motion. Then Joseph offers what he believes is an improvement. In the second measure, Alois employs an 8/3 chord, which Joseph changes to a 5/3 triad by using his inner voice to leap to the note A. Joseph is supposed to be a modern student who cares most about the richness of harmony and using full triads. Alois, who is a stand-in for Palestrina and the old vocal style, prioritizes the perfect smoothness of each melodic line, and is not willing to sacrifice that smoothness even for a richer harmony. Fuchs presents this disagreement as a difference in style, one side more melodically focused and the other more focused on harmony. As the decades went on, authors of counterpoint textbooks tended to shift more and more towards the harmonic style, some even making it a rule that there must be a complete 5/3 or 6/3 triad in each measure, no matter how disfluent the melodies must become. An example of this comes from François-Joseph Fétis, whose C major Cantus Firmus I use in the thumbnails for each of the videos in this series. Most often, awkward leaps are relegated to the bass line, and Fétis' bass leaps much more often than it steps, even featuring large consecutive leaps in the same direction. This is idiomatic for instrumental bass lines, but it would be quite unexpected in any of the other voices. On the other hand, a majority of Fétis' chords are full triads. I intentionally tried to compose my thumbnail example with a more melodic style of bass line, in order to show the range of styles that are possible. I'll leave you with these two Cantus Firmi by Nadia Boulanger. You can use them to compose whole note counterpoints in 3 voices. Place each Cantus Firmus in the top, middle, and bottom voice of the texture for a total of 6 exercises. This is also an excellent opportunity for us to improve our ability to audiate chords and triads in our heads. Audiating the specific voicing of a 3-voice chord and hearing 3 simultaneous scale degrees clearly in your imagination without singing or reference to an instrument is a seriously underappreciated skill, and is much more challenging and rewarding than it sounds to someone who's never tried it. Stay tuned for the next video, when we will begin to take our first steps beyond the traditional counterpoint exercises, venturing into combined species counterpoint, thorough bass, and dissonant chord types.